So without further ado, I know I blabbed on for a long time, but it was worth it. Please rise to your feet and join me in welcoming this son of the Midwest. He's a veteran. He's a dog owner, right? He's a husband. He's also the mayor of South Bend, and his story has been taking America by storm. Brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, the one and only Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Good to see you. All yours.
Thanks for having me. All right. Hello. Wow. Good afternoon. Thank you. Thanks so much. Grab a seat, please. Thank you. I will be as concise as I can so that we can make the most of the time to have a conversation. But I'm so excited to be with you. All of my interactions with the NLC over the years have been encouraging and inspiring, and I think it's fitting as I seek to become the first millennial president of the United States that we spend some time together talking about what that would mean. Let me just briefly introduce what motivated me to make the admittedly unorthodox move as a 37-year-old Midwestern mayor to seek the American presidency. I get that it is more customary to have some number of years or decades marinating in Washington to have probably a little more silver hair than I've got, although every time I open Twitter I get a couple new ones, before running for president. And this is very much not the plan when I started my career in public office at the beginning of this decade, that this was what I would be doing at the end. But I believe America's running out of time. I believe we are at a moment of such urgency that even now we are probably underreacting. And I believe that this presidency, while a colossal problem for this country, is actually not the problem. The question I ask myself is how a presidency like the one we're living under right now is even possible. How a guy like this ever even gets within cheating distance of the Oval Office. That doesn't happen under ordinary circumstances. That doesn't happen unless something is wrong. And I believe this is largely a consequence of things that have been shifting beneath our feet for as long as we've been alive. That our generation's experience in many ways reflects the failure of our institutions across our entire lifespans to deliver a just society, a healthy economy, and a peaceful world, and that we're going to have to come up with something completely different. We've grown up with school shootings as the norm. I was a junior when Columbine happened. I'm meeting kids now on the campaign trail who represent the second school shooting generation. We have a responsibility to make sure there's not a third. We are spending the majority of our adult lives on the business end of climate change. I have had to activate the Emergency Operations Center of South Bend twice in a space of 18 months, each time for an extreme rainfall event that should only happen every few hundred years. We are growing up in an economy such that we're on track to be the first generation in American history to earn less than our parents, unless we do something different. Which is why it's time to do something very, very different. And I'm worried that my party is still tempted to deliver a message that basically says, we're going to go back to normal. In other words, and I get the premise of it, right? The premise of it is, look at this presidency. Look at what we're living through. This is nuts. We can't take this. This is exhausting. All of that part's true. The part that isn't true is that it follows from that we ought to go back to normal. Because we wouldn't be here if normal were working. Normal doesn't work, at least the normal that we grew up in. And that's why it will fall to us, the generation that has grown up with these things, also the most diverse generation in American history, the generation that provided most of the bulk of the troops in the conflicts after 9/11. It's going to fall to our generation to figure this out. And we can no longer wait to see if others will do it for us. Part of what I'm trying to do is reorient the way my party talks about our policies around values. So I'll come to some of the policies in a minute, but this is very important because I'm afraid that as long as we've been alive, again, you start the clock roughly in the early 80s, at least that's how long I've been alive. The word values itself has come to be regarded as a conservative thing. And yet many of these values, if you take them seriously, in my view, point you in a very progressive direction. You look at the value of freedom. And we've been kind of coached to think that all there is to freedom is cutting regulation somewhere. But I believe you're not free if you don't have access to health care. If you can't go start a small business because you can't leave your old job because that'd mean losing your coverage. I also don't think you're free if you are a woman whose reproductive health care is being dictated by male politicians in Boston. I don't think you're free as a black American living in a country where you are 3 times more likely to experience maternal mortality, 4 times more likely to be arrested for the exact same offense in 2019. This is a question of freedom. Needless to say, I don't think you're free if the county clerk gets to tell you who you ought to marry based on their interpretation of their religion. So we got to reimagine what freedom means, and suddenly we realize it's taken us to a progressive place. Same thing with security, which has been used as a cudgel to beat Democrats over the head by the right saying that they were the national security party. And yet, if you look at the security challenges in front of us in the 21st century, and then you look at the president's idea of how to fix them, he's got a 17th century solution, which is building a wall. At a time when 21st century security challenges include cybersecurity and election security, which Senate Republicans made clear they're not going to allow us to build out this year. It's things like the security concern that is the gun violence epidemic in this country. Naming and confronting white nationalist violence, which is a huge security problem in our country. And naming climate disruption as the security challenge that it is in our time. That's a security problem, and we got to treat it as such. In addition to the work we've got to do to end endless war, and I say this as somebody who thought I was one of the last troops turning out the lights years ago in Afghanistan. And we need to prepare for whatever it will take to restore U.S. credibility before it's too late. So we're going to have a different conversation about security, about freedom, also, by the way, about faith. We tread lightly here because we care about the separation of church and state. We care that our leaders never use religion against somebody, and we care about speaking for people of any religion and of no religion. But people who are motivated by religious values need to know they have a choice. That if tomorrow morning we're going to go and hear scripture about our responsibility to take care of the marginalized and the least among us and the poor and the hungry, and to welcome the stranger, stranger being a synonym for immigrant, that has political implications. And you don't have to be on board with putting kids in cages if you believe in anything, actually. Any religious or secular ethical tradition tells us that what's going on in this White House is dead wrong. So people need to be reminded they have a choice. Now, none of this is going to happen if we don't fix our democracy. So another thing we've got to deal with that has to be fixed during the lifetime of our generation is the ways in which our democracy is becoming less democratic. Partly through racial and partisan gerrymandering that has politicians choosing their voters instead of the other way around. Partly through the role of money in politics, but also stuff that doesn't get talked about much. The fact that our fellow U.S. citizens in Puerto Rico or D.C. lack political representation. It is unjustifiable. For my dime, the simple fact that in our democracy we don't pick our president by just counting up all the votes and giving it to the person who got the most votes. To me, that's a breakdown in democracy. We have to be willing to challenge some of these structural things that we've gotten used to and no longer take as an acceptable justification the idea that we've always done it this way. I think we've got to do it a different way. And all of the policies I'm putting forward follow from that. We've put forward policies around knitting our social fabric back together in a call to service that would deliver 1 million opportunities for paid national service across America. But it'll make all of us better off. Put forward a Douglas plan that is as ambitious as the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe. Only this time, this is about investing right here at home and making sure that the black experience in America is equal, not inferior, when it comes to health, home ownership, employment, criminal justice, democracy, and access to capital for building new business. All of these things require intentional action because intentional action made them unequal in the first place. So that's our policy. We've put forward and rolled out yesterday in Ankeny, actually, here in Iowa, a new set of policies around labor and wages that recognize the fact that our economy cannot be organized around the assumption of a single employer for the balance of your adult life. It doesn't work that way. Not for us, right? Not for most of us. So how about we let gig workers enjoy the same benefits as everybody else, because a gig is, in fact, a job. and a contractor is in fact a worker, and we can organize this in a way that actually makes things work for everybody. The central problem of our time economically is that the rising tide really did rise, and most of the boats didn't budge. If we do not fix that, things are going to get even worse in this country. I'm convinced of it. But if we do fix it, then when I get to retirement age, I'm tracking 2055. That's the year I get to the current age of the current president. I'm going to look back at this year, at 2020, and say that this was the year we got things on the right track, that we actually delivered a country where your race was not a predictor of your life expectancy or your wealth. We actually delivered a country where climate was no longer a threat to our way of life. We actually delivered a life in which gun violence was exotic and strange, where rising tide really did lift all boats. That's what this is about. And I believe that in order to win, and in order to deserve to win, we have to put forward bolder answers and with greater urgency than we have done at any point in my life. And that's why I'm running for president. So I'll leave it at that. Have a conversation about it. Thanks so much for having
me. So I want to begin our conversation actually with something that people don't think millennials care about, which is foreign policy. But as our world becomes smaller, our generation is more and more engaged about what happens in the world. And a recent Wall Street Journal article pointed to the fact that it's possible that North Korea could be testing missiles again. So in a Buttigieg foreign policy doctrine, how would you deal with North Korea?
Yeah, well, first of all, you won't see me sending love letters to Kim Jong-un. So let me point to one thing that's kind of positive that's happened in this situation on the Korean Peninsula, which is that I think the old framework, the old doctrine, said that we needed to achieve denuclearization completely before we could have any kind of conversation about peace on the peninsula between North and South. I think where we're evolving toward is that we can take incremental steps in tandem in each area that will build toward progress in the others. We're not going to, I mean, the president does not have a plan, and we're not going to get anywhere without a strategy. But there are measures that we can undertake that will be very incremental in the first instance, but that can begin to establish a path toward denuclearization, because obviously the conditions for North Korea are not sustainable either. And it's going to require talks. We have to talk. But we cannot talk in a way that demonstrates an administration not even pretending to care about democracy and human rights if we want to have a values-led foreign policy. And the wider doctrine that I put forward is one where we recognize that American interests and American values can't be separated. Every time we've sold out our values in the name of what we thought were our interests, it caught up to us. Sometimes it took a generation to do it, but it caught up to us in Central America, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in a certain way in our relationship with Russia. It always catches up to us. And so now is a time when actually America is needed more than ever. I mean, look at China, the Chinese model being held up as an alternative to ours because ours looks chaotic and fragile. It's exactly the kind of moment when the world actually needs to hear, with Russia, Saudi Arabia throwing their weight around the way they are. But it can't be just any America. It has to be an America that is actually serious about the values that we espouse.
Thank you. So the first question will come from one of our fellows from the great state of Georgia. Sharice?
Hi, Mayor Pete.
Hi.
My name is Sharice Price, and I'm a supplier diversity professional based in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you for being here. I'm right here. Thank you for being here today. To your earlier point about the millennial generation's financial security, Can you talk specifically about how you'll help us as president be financially secure and ensure that we have opportunities for upward mobility?
Yeah, this is so important because, again, our generation's at a disadvantage here. Part of it is making sure that we have an economy that actually supports us in our work, whether that work is in a conventional workplace or not. It's why I've proposed access to different kinds of benefits and unionization. It's why I'm trying to break down some of the magic between working 40 hours a week and being part-time. So, for example, the way we propose sick leave ought to work is, you know, if you're driving for Uber 7 hours a week, then 7 divided by 40 is how much that ought to go into a sick leave bank that should be administered. And then your other jobs would do the same. We're going to need to shore up Social Security, but also over and above that, develop another layer of retirement security that's based on something portable that any of your employers can pay into, but that you take with you. And there's a lot of talk about portable benefits. I would add to that the idea that benefits should be portable and prorated. That's what I mean by if you have a part-time job, it should still contribute in some way. We also need to recognize that certain benefits ought to be decoupled from the workplace. That's why it makes no sense to have your health care depend on your job if your job's going to change so many times. Why we got to create the pathway to universal health care. So those are some examples of the kinds of measures we got to undertake. The fundamental idea is that the economy is not working according to the same structures. And if we want to thrive as we grow up, we can't assume that it's ever going to go back, because it's not.
Thanks, Mayor Pete. So staying on healthcare for just a second, I want to turn to another one of our fellows from the state of from Cincinnati, Ohio, Midwest as well as yourself, Anthony Johnson. Anthony?
Hi, Mayor Pete.
Hi.
Thanks for being here today. My name is Anthony. I'm the chapter director of New Leaders Council in Southwest Ohio.
Great.
I want to start my question by saying that the lack of access to mental health care is an extreme problem in the country. We talk a lot about physical health care, but there are far too many inconsistencies in the way private health insurance providers, Medicaid, and Medicare provide access. What would you do in your first 100 days as president to ensure real mental health care parity?
Right. It's so important because we're realizing just how many Americans are impacted by mental health issues. And while parity is increasingly on the books as a matter of kind of language, it's not actually happening, right? So there are a lot of provisions in the ACA on this, but what winds up happening is you've got provider shortages that mean even if you can get mental health care covered, you can't actually get an appointment or find somebody in your network. So part of what we got to do is make sure, and this is going to take more than 100 days, but we got to start on day one, is make sure that we have a better pipeline for providers to come in. And that means educating and preparing more mental health providers. And it's one of the things that I think comes about from the cultural work we got to do, in addition to the policy work. That is just about breaking down the stigma that has people reluctant to talk about this in the first place. We'll know we're getting somewhere when it is as customary and as well covered to have an emotional health care checkup as it is to have a physical. That's what success looks like. But to get there, reimbursement's got to catch up, training's got to catch up, the culture's got to catch up, and it is both a policy question and a vocabulary question for our country to recognize that we really do get it. Thanks.
So our next question, keeping sort of on this issue of care in the community, we're going to turn to Brandon Mock from Houston, Texas. Brandon?
Hi, Mayor Pete.
Hi.
My name is Brandon Mack. I'm from the great city of Houston, Texas, and I'm the chapter director there. So my question to you is, what policies are you willing to put into place specifically for the Black LGBTQ community?
Right. So the isolation and the intersectional pressure that Black LGBTQ Americans experience is, for many, crushing. I've met so many young people in the context of this campaign who feel that they don't have anywhere to turn. Actually, Houston is a place where I found a very robust Black LGBTQ faith community that's been really inspiring, and we need to see more of that kind of empowerment going on in other American cities. But the reality is that we shouldn't be surprised that people are more likely to come to harm, whether it is Black trans women facing violence at a much higher rate than most, and that needs to be named and needs to be confronted, or whether it is the fact that while both a Black American and an LGBTQ American are more likely to be homeless, Black LGBTQ youth are among the most vulnerable. It means that we need to have federal policies that recognize the particular vulnerability that some people face. We've tried for too long to have neutral policies based on that theory that a rising tide lifts all boats. And what we've learned, I think, across our lifespan is that if you replace a racist policy with a neutral one, that's not enough for inequities to work their way out of the system because harms compound. So we've got to be proactive. It's why many of the elements of the Douglas Plan call for us to be intentional. So a good example that would specifically impact the Black LGBTQ community is our proposal for health equity zones. The idea here is that, first of all, we know that in the clinical context, people are at a disadvantage. We know that one of the reasons why we have triple the rate of maternal mortality for black mothers is that black patients are less likely to have their accounts of pain taken seriously in the clinical environment. There are similar issues, especially with HHS guidance moving in the wrong direction, that are specific to trans Americans. A lot of it, though, is what happens outside the clinical environment, the environment you live in, access to food, just to healthy food. So we propose that communities take the lead on crafting a plan that touches all of these, from what happens in the hospital, in the doctor's office, to the social determinants of health that can be such a big part of the issue. And then the federal government would come in and help, not by deciding out of Washington how it's supposed to work, but by funding the community-developed health equity zones. So that's one example of how black residents and black Americans broadly, but in particular, very vulnerable black LGBTQ Americans benefit when we have a policy that can tell the difference and that understands that equity is not the same as telling everybody we're going to treat you the exact same and expect everything to be better at the same rate for all Americans.
Mayor Pete, allow me to follow up on that. So the president in his State of the Union address issued this sort of mandate that he was going to solve HIV/AIDS by 2030. And part of that is, redirecting some funds at HHS, working with NIH to direct the money. What we're seeing is where you see the highest, the HIV/AIDS transmission rate, the highest is along the intersection, right? Latinx and LGBTQ. Black and LGBTQ. So beyond like the economic zones, what plan would you put forward to deal with the intersections of how do you provide access and care to those intersections to ensure that the HIV/AIDS transmission rate goes down there?
Yeah, well, a lot of this doesn't get better until we expand healthcare so that it is universal. It's one of the reasons why we need, different Democrats have put forward different visions. Mine is you start with a Medicare for all who want it ramp, and then you take that as the glide path that'll get us to universal healthcare. But we need to make sure that coverage is available. There are also very specific things that need to happen with regard to PrEP. And getting people access to ways to prevent transmission. And there's a real crisis in the pricing of some of these drugs. And so it's, in fact, one of the areas that is most symptomatic of where a patent law system that's designed to promote innovation has actually, in some cases, stifled the ability of that innovation to spread and save lives among those who need it most. And it's why if you see companies unwilling to take reasonable, we're all for companies that come up with miracle drugs being rewarded, that's fine. But if we get into a world where they're able to, for example, tinker with little cosmetic changes that allow patents to be evergreened in a way that is not actually contributing new value, then we have to have the power not only to negotiate with them, but to look at the validity of their patent in order to make sure that these life-saving drugs are actually available. That's how we prevent transmission. That's how we actually meet a goal, like being able to end the epidemic by 2030 or sooner.
Great, so let's change the topics a little bit. Let's change the topic to public education. So all across the country over the past 2 years, we've seen educators walk out of the classroom, right? Whether it be in West Virginia, where it started, Oklahoma, Denver, Los Angeles, Oakland, the list is long. And they're all demanding the same thing. How do we make public schools better? So I want to turn to an educator who's in our audience. She's a librarian, a school board member right here in Des Moines, Iowa. Great. Kirsten?
Hi, my name is Kirsten Delagardelle, and I'm a dedicated teacher librarian and school board member right here in Des Moines. Thanks for being here with us today. From 2005 to 2017, public schools in the U.S. were underfunded by $580 billion from the federal government, money that was meant to support 30 million vulnerable students in the communities all across our country. What will you do as president to restore this funding and invest in neighborhood public schools so that they have more resources for textbooks, nurses, and counselors? Great.
Well, first of all, thanks for what you do. And I wish there were more people who had experience in schools on school boards. So I'm glad to hear that you bring that together. We could also use that in Washington, or at the very least have a Secretary of Education who believes in public education. So that's something I would start with. Legislatively, look, we have got to properly fund public education, beginning with Title I. We need to massively increase funding going to Title I schools where it's needed most. And more broadly, I believe that the federal government, with a carrot and stick approach, can induce states to have more equitable funding across districts. What we have right now is possibly the only developed country. In most countries, when you have a district or a school area where students are lowest income or greatest need, you get a little more going into those than you do the average. We're the only country where it's actually less because of the way we fund our schools, right? We punish poor kids for being poor. And often with well-intentioned kind of metric-based, and I'm all for accountability and making sure that we measure our progress, but in a place like Indiana, often the way that some of the testing results are used even further punishes poor kids for being poor. Because I can already tell you which schools are going to struggle the most based on their demographics. And if we're measuring the effectiveness of our best teachers, that's one thing, that's great. But if we're just measuring where you are, we shouldn't be surprised if kids who are hungry and kids in buildings that are falling apart aren't going to do as well. So one of the best things that we can do that would make a difference is supporting teachers in professional development and just the profession overall. For the first time, a majority of teachers say that they would discourage their kids from becoming teachers. Part of that's just the level of respect that is shown to the profession. A very related thing is the level of compensation going into the profession. One of the leaders on my policy team did a body of research using IRS data to actually compute the value, the difference in somebody's lifetime earnings if they had a great teacher versus an average teacher, and found that the value of one of the best teachers in one kindergarten classroom per year, in terms of how much added lifetime earnings those kids will go on to have, is $300,000 per teacher per year. Needless to say, compensation doesn't quite reflect that value added in our economy, right? But in a lot of societies, you see teachers honored a little more like soldiers and paid a little more like doctors. And if we move that way, and I propose that we have a federal program targeted primarily at Title I schools to elevate teacher compensation, we will see that begin to happen and support the profession, which in turn has a lot of impacts for the performance of the kids.
So, Mayor Pete, this is interesting. So the three folks that showed up to our forum are all mayors. So, and I think the role of mayor is an interesting role. So I want to get one of our questions that talks about your role as mayor. So to do that, I want to turn to Kayla Shelton from Detroit.
Great.
Kayla?
Hi.
Hi, Mayor Pete. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thanks for having me.
My name is Kayla Shelton, and I am an NLC Fellow from Detroit, Michigan.
All right.
With the recent death of Eric Loken at the hands of local police, what lessons did you learn from the aftermath? And how will this reflect on your platform, specifically for the Black community? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for raising it. It's one of the most, it's one of the things we're going through as a community right now, but it touches something that I think every diverse community is feeling. The level of mistrust and fear between communities of color and Black Americans in particular and law enforcement. What happened in South Bend, if you haven't followed it closely, was there was an incident about a month ago. A Black man named Eric Logan was shot during an encounter with a white police officer. According to the officer, he was attacked with a knife. It was precisely with moments like this in mind that we set up body cameras. We introduced them about a year ago. The officer didn't have his body camera on at the time. And so I called for an outside investigation, and that's what's going on right now. A prosecutor's looking into it. But the reality is, and the biggest thing I've learned from our community's experiences, this goes way beyond what happened to that family and that individual. And it goes way beyond anything we can learn about what happened in that particular incident. The reason that there was so much pain unleashed by what happened there was that there is such a history. The uniform has a history. The community has a history. And part of the message that I've offered to our officers, which not all of them are ready to hear, is that even the best person who has ever put on a uniform is still burdened by the injustices that have happened by people wearing that uniform every day when we get a cell phone video from somewhere around the country where something is happening, and both present and historic issues. And so it is going to be imperative, not just in the name of justice, but frankly so that police officers can do their job of keeping people safe, that we tear down that wall of mistrust. How do we actually do it? Well, what we're doing right now in South Bend is, first of all, inviting the community to be part of the process for evaluating our use of force policies. Are the use of force policies the right one? If they were different, would we be less likely to have seen something happen like what happened that day? Same thing with training, because it's one thing to have the policies on the books. It's another thing to actually have officers know what to do. We're also making sure that the community has a say in our board of safety. So the way it works in South Bend, under Indiana laws, we got a board that hires and fires officers. They do the discipline. On my watch, that board, which I appoint, has raised the bar for accountability. But a lot of citizens don't feel like they really have a voice in that board, even though we've made it extremely diverse and extremely representative. And so we're reimagining the application process for how somebody gets on the board to make sure there's more community buy-in there. A big part of it's transparency. And for years we've been working on things like, when I came in, there was no public reporting of things like use of force. And so we started pushing it online. We created a police transparency data website that anybody can look at. And there's some amazing work done by, for example, the Movement for Black Lives has set up statistical evaluations where they're doing report cards on cities based on some of the data they push out. I don't know of a city our size in our region that's been able to do it, so I'm proud that we did it, but we've obviously got a long way to go. And I think a lot of what we have to do is recognize that even as communities strive to do the right thing, and strive to recognize the humanity involved and also the stakes that are involved in the fear that people feel. You should, when you see a police officer, the feeling that you should experience ought to be safety. I think somebody is here to help me. And that is not the experience for too many Americans. If we don't fix that, we are all worse off. And so I'm also having a conversation with mostly white audiences about what we need to do about this. Because this can't be talked about as a specialty issue that is something that only leaders of color talk about, or that white politicians only talk about when addressing audiences of color. And so the other impact of this incident, for better or for worse, and I'm going to make sure that it's for better, is I'm going to be one of the white politicians in America who gets the most questions about race. I just am. Let's use that as an opportunity to have a conversation that a lot of white audiences have not been ready for. Because while it is... It is not true that the rising tide lifts all boats, but it is true that until some of the boats are unchained from the ocean floor, everybody's worse off. And I'm going to have you, I invite everybody to watch how I talk about this with different kinds of audiences because it's urgent for the entire country. Thanks.
So we're running out of time, so we're going to do some lightning round questions.
All right, lightning round.
Definitely a lighter subject matter than this one. Favorite movie?
I don't have a single favorite. Godfather's great cinematically.
One word, I forgot, so one rule, one word answer.
All right. Let's go with Dr. Strangelove.
Dr. Strangelove. Last concert.
No, Chastity and I totally went to a really good Avett Brothers. It was Avett Brothers.
All right. Favorite color?
Blue.
Blue. Same as mine.
It's a good color.
And the last thing you watched on Netflix?
When They See Us.
When They See Us. Ladies and gentlemen, Mayor Pete Buttigieg.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.